Chapter 22 of A Man of Honor by George Carey Eggleston. Recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22 Mr. Sharp Does His Duty. The law firm of Steele, Flint & Sharp was a thoroughly well constituted one. Its organization was an admirable example of means perfectly adapted to the accomplishment of ends. It was not an eminent firm, but it was an eminently successful one, particularly in the lines of business to which it gave special attention, and the leading one of these was collecting doubtful debts, as Cousin Sarah Ann had learned from one of the firm's cards which had fallen in her way. Indeed, it was the accidental possession of this card which enabled her to put the matter of Robert's indebtedness into the hands of New York attorneys, and I suspect that she would never have thought of doing so at all but for the enticing words, fairly printed upon the card, "Particular attention given to the collection of doubtful debts due to non-residents of New York." A prophet, we know, is not without honor save in his own country, and so it is not strange that the people who familiarly knew the countenances of the gentlemen composing the firm of Steele, Flint & Sharp esteemed these gentlemen less highly than did those other people, resident outside of New York, who could know these counselors at law only through their profusely distributed cards and circulars. Such was the fact. And as a result, it happened that the clients of the firm were chiefly people who, living in other parts of the country, were compelled to entrust their business in New York to the hands of whatever attorneys they believed were the leading ones in the metropolis. And it was to let people know who were the leading lawyers of the city that Messrs. Steele, Flint & Sharp industriously scattered their cards and circulars throughout the country. Who Mr. Steele was I do not know, and I am strongly inclined to suspect that the rest of the world, including his partners, were in a state of equal ignorance. He was never seen about the firm's offices, and never represented anybody in court, but he was frequently referred to by his partners, especially when clients were disposed to complain of apparently exorbitant charges. "Mr. Steele cannot give his attention to a case, sir, for nothing. His reputation is at stake, sir, in all we undertake. I really do not feel at liberty to ask Mr. Steele to authorize any reduction in this case, sir. He gave his personal attention to the papers. His personal attention, sir." And this would commonly send clients away suppressed, if not satisfied. Mr. Flint was well enough known. He managed the business of the firm. It was he who always knew precisely what Mr. Steele's opinion was. He alone, of all the world, was able to speak positively of matters concerning Mr. Steele. Mr. Sharp was his junior in the firm, though considerably his senior in years. For Mr. Sharp, Mr. Flint entertained not one particle of respect, because that gentleman was not always what his name implied. Mr. Sharp left to himself would have been hopelessly honest and straightforward. He would have gone to the dogs, speedily, Mr. Flint said, but for his association with himself. "But you have excellent ability in your way, Sharp, excellent ability," he would say when in a good humor. "You are a capital executive officer, a very good lieutenant. Your ideas of what to do in any given case are not always good, but when I tell you what to do, you do it, Sharp. I always know you will do what I tell you, and do it well, too." Mr. Sharp usually came to the office an hour earlier than Mr. Flint did, in order that he might have everything ready for Mr. Flint's examination when that gentleman should arrive. He read the letters, drew up papers, and was prepared to give his partner in each case the facts upon which his opinion or advice was necessary. On the morning of December 3rd, Mr. Flint came softly into his office, and, after hanging up his overcoat and warming his hands at the register, went into his inner den, saying, as he sat down, "I'm ready for you now, Sharp." Mr. Sharp arose from his desk and entered the private room, with his hands full of papers. "What's the first thing on docket, Sharp?" "Well, here's a collection to be made. Debtor Robert Pagebrook, temporarily in the city. Boarding place not known. Writes for the newspapers so I can easily find him. Creditor Edwin Pagebrook of something Courthouse, Virginia. Debtor got creditor to cash draft for $300. Draft protested. Debtor came away and promised to take up paper by 15th November. Hasn't done it. Instructions, push him." "Any limitations?" "No." "What have you done?" "Nothing yet. I'll look him up today and dun him." "Yes, and let him get away from you. Sharp, do you know that Julius Caesar is dead?" "Certainly." "I'm glad to hear that you do know something, then. Don't you see the point in this case? Go and make out affidavits on information. This fellow Robert What's his name is a transient, and we'll get an order of arrest all ready, and then you can dun him with some sense. Have your officer with you, or convenient, and if he don't pay up, chuck him in jail. That's the way to do it. Never waste time dunning transients when there's a ghost of a chance to cage them." "Well, but there don't seem to be any fraud here. The man seems to have had funds in the bank, only the bank suspended." "Sharp, you'll learn a little law after a while, I hope. Don't you know the courts never look very sharply after cases where transients are concerned? How do we know he had money in the bank? Is there anything to show it?" "No, I believe not." "Well, then, don't you go making facts in the interest of the other side. Let him make that out if he can. You just draw your affidavits to suit our purposes, not his. Go on to state that he drew a certain bill of exchange and represented that he had funds, and so fraudulently obtained money and all that. And then go on to say that his draft upon presentation was protested, and that instead of making it good he absconded. Be sure to say absconded, Sharp. It's half the battle. Courts haven't much use for men that abscond and then turn up in New York. Make your case strong enough, though. We only swear on information, you know, so if we do put it a little strong it don't matter. There, go and fix it up right away, and then catch your man." A few hours later, as Robert Pagebrook sat writing in his room, Mr. Sharp and another man were shown in. Mr. Sharp opened the conversation. "This is Mr. Pagebrook, I believe?" "Yes, sir." "Mr. Robert Pagebrook?" "Yes, that is my name." "Thank you. My name is Sharp, of the firm of Steel, Flint and Sharp. That's our card, sir. I have called to solicit the payment, sir, of a small amount due Mr. Edwin Pagebrook, who has written asking us to collect it for him. The amount is $300, I think. Yes, here is the draft. Can you let me have the money today, Mr. Pagebrook?" "I have already remitted 1/3 the amount, sir," said Robert, "and I hope to send the remainder in installments very soon. At present it is simply impossible for me to pay anything more." "Have you a receipt for the amount remitted?" asked the lawyer. "No, it was sent only yesterday. But if you will hold the draft a week or 10 days longer, I will be able, within that time, to earn the whole of the amount remaining due, and your client will advise you, I am sure, of the receipt of the $100 already sent." "We are not authorized to wait, sir," said Mr. Sharp. "On the contrary, our instructions are positive to push the case." "But what can I do?" asked Robert. "I have already sent every dollar I had, and until I earn more I can pay no more." "The case is a peculiar one, sir. It has the appearance of a fraudulent debt and an attempt to run away from it. I must do my duty by my client, sir, and so this gentleman, who is a sheriff's officer, has an order for your arrest which I must ask him to serve if you do not pay the debt to-day." "Let him serve it at once, then," said Robert. "I cannot pay now." Chapter 23 of A Man of Honor by George Carey Eggleston. Chapter 23 Mr. Pagebrook Takes a Lesson in the Law. As Robert was unable to give bail without calling upon his friend Dudley, which he determined not to do in any case, he was taken to the jail and locked up. Upon his arrival there he employed a messenger to carry a note to a young lawyer with whom he happened to be slightly acquainted, asking him to come to the jail at once. When he arrived, Robert said to him, "Let me tell you in the outset, Mr. Dyker, that I have no money and no friends. Wherefore, if you will allow me to consult you at all, it must be with the understanding that I cannot possibly pay you for your services until I can make the money. If you are willing to trust me to that extent, we can proceed to business." "You are very honorable, sir, to inform me beforehand of this fact. Pray go on. I will do what I can for you." "In the first place, then," said Robert, "I am a little puzzled to know how or why I am locked up. You have the papers. Will you tell me how it is?" "Oh, it's plain enough. You are held under an order of arrest." "But I don't understand. I thought imprisonment for debt was a thing of the past, in this country at least, and my only offense is indebtedness. Is it possible that men may still be imprisoned for debt in America?" "Well, that is about it," said the lawyer. "We have abolished the name but retained the thing in a slightly modified form, in New York at least. Theoretically you are not imprisoned, but merely held to answer. The plaintiffs have made out a case of fraud and non-residence, and so they had plain sailing." "But I always understood that our Constitution, or our law, or something else, secured every man against imprisonment, except by due process of law, and gave to every accused person the right to be confronted with his accusers, to cross-examine witnesses, and to have his guilt or innocence passed upon by a jury of his countrymen." "That is the theory, but there are some classes of cases which are practically exceptions, and yours is one of them." "Then," said Robert, "it is true, is it, that an American may be arrested and sent to jail without trial, upon the mere strength of affidavits made by lawyers who know nothing of the facts except what they have heard from distant, irresponsible, and personally interested clients? Affidavits upon information, I believe you call them?" "Well, you put it a little strongly, perhaps, but those are the facts in New York. Respectable lawyers, however, are careful to satisfy themselves of the facts before proceeding at all in such cases. And so the law, which is a very convenient one, rarely ever works injustice, I think. Not once in 20 times, I should say." "But," said Robert, "the personal liberty of every non-resident and some resident debtors is, or in some cases may be, dependent solely upon the character of attorneys, as I understand you." "In some cases, yes. But pardon me. Had we not better come to the matter in hand?" "As we are not a legislature, perhaps it would be better," said Robert. He then proceeded to relate the facts of the case, beginning with his drawing of the draft in good faith, its protest, and his consequent perplexity. "I did not abscond at all," he continued, "but came away to see if I could save something from the wreck of the bank, and to seek work. In leaving, I promised to pay the debt on or before the 15th of last month, feeling certain that I could do so. I failed to do it never mind, I failed to do it, but I have been trying hard ever since to get the money and discharge the obligation. I yesterday remitted $100, and should have sent the rest as fast as I could make it. These are the facts. Now, how am I going to get out of here?" "You have nobody to go your bail?" "Nobody." "And no money?" "None. I sold my watch in order to get money on which to live while I was looking for work." "You did have money enough to your credit in that bank to have made your draft good if the bank hadn't suspended?" "Yes." "You can swear to that?" "Certainly." "Then I think we can manage this matter without much difficulty. We can admit the facts, but deny the fraudulent intent in affidavits of our own, and get discharged on that ground. I think we can easily overthrow the theory of fraud by showing that you actually had the money in bank, and swearing that you drew against it in good faith." "Pardon me, but in doing that, I should be bound, should I not, in honor if not in law, to state all the facts of the case in my affidavit? The theory of the proceeding is that I am putting the court in possession of all the facts and withholding nothing, is it not?" "Well, yes, I suppose it is." "Then let us abandon that plan forthwith." "But, my dear sir—" "Pray don't argue the point. My mind is fully made up. Is there no other mode of securing my release?" "Yes, you might schedule out under Article 5 of the Non-Imprisonment Act, I think." "How is that?" "It is a sort of insolvency or bankruptcy proceeding by which you come into court, any court of record, and offer to give up everything you have to your creditors, giving a sworn catalogue of all your debts and all your property, and praying release on the ground that you are unable to do more." "Well, as I have literally nothing in the way of property just now, that mode of procedure seems to fit my case precisely," said Robert, whose courage and good humor and indomitable cheerfulness stood him in good stead in this time of very sore trial. The world looked gloomy enough to him then in whatever way he chose to look at it, but the instinct of fight was large within him, and in the absence of other joys he felt a savage pleasure in knowing that his life henceforth must be a constant struggle against fearful odds, odds of prejudice as well as of poverty, for who could now take him by the hand and say to others, "This is my friend"? "It's too late to accomplish anything to day, Mr. Pagebrook," said the lawyer, looking at his watch. "But I will be here by 10 o'clock to morrow morning, and we will then go to work for your deliverance, which we can effect, I think, pretty quick. Good evening, sir." End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of A Man of Honor by George Carey Eggleston. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24. Mr. Pagebrook cuts himself loose from the past and plans a future. When the lawyer had gone, Robert sat down to deliberate upon the situation and to decide what was to be done in matters aside from the question of his release. He had that morning received Colonel Barksdale's letter and Miss Sudie's. These must be answered at once, and he was not quite certain how he should answer them. After turning the matter over, he determined upon his course, and, according to his custom, having determined what to do, he at once set about doing it. Having brought a supply of paper and envelopes from his room, he had only to borrow pen and ink from the attendant. His first letter was addressed to the president of the college from which he had received his appointment as professor, and it consisted of a simple resignation, with no explanation except that contained in the sentence, "I can ill afford to surrender the position or the salary, but there are painful circumstances surrounding me, which compel me to this course. Pray excuse me from a fuller statement of the case." To Colonel Barksdale he wrote, "Your letter surprises me only in its kindness and gentleness of tone. Under the circumstances, I could have forgiven a good deal of harshness. For your forbearance, however, you have my hearty thanks. And now as to the subject matter of your note. I am sorry to say I can offer neither denial nor satisfactory explanation of the facts alleged against me. I must bear the blame that attaches to what I have done, and bearing that blame, I know my duty to you and your family. I shall write by this mail to Miss Barksdale volunteering a release, which otherwise you would have a right to demand of me." Sealing this and directing it, Robert came to the hardest task of all, the writing of a letter to Cousin Sudie. "I hardly know how to write to you," he wrote. "Your generous faith in me in spite of everything is more than I had any right to expect, and more, I think, than you have any right in justice to yourself to give me. I thank you for it right heartily, but I feel that I must not accept it. When you listened to my words of love and gave them a place in your heart, I was a gentleman without reproach. Now a stain is upon my name, which I can never remove. The man to whom you promised your hand was not the absconding debtor who writes you this from a jail. I send this letter, therefore, to offer you a release from your engagement with me, if indeed any release be necessary. You cannot afford to know me or even to remember me hereafter. Forget me then, or, if you cannot wholly forget, remember me only as an adventurer who for a paltry sum sold his good name. Good-bye. I wish you well with all my heart." As he sealed these letters, Robert felt that his hopes for the future were sealed up with them, and that the post which should bear them away would carry with it the better part of his life. And yet he did not wholly surrender himself to despair, as a weaker man might have done. The old life was gone from him forever. The only people whom he had known as in any sense his own would grasp his hand no more, and if they ever thought of him again it would be only to regret that they had known him at all. All this he felt keenly, but it did not follow that he should abandon himself as a consequence. He was still a young man, and there was time enough for him to make a new life for himself, to find new friends, and to do some worthy work in the world. And to the planning of this new life he at once addressed himself. He would teach no longer, and now that he had cut himself loose from that profession, there was opportunity to do something at the business which he had found so agreeable of late. He would devote himself hereafter wholly to writing, and at the first opportunity he would become a regular member of the staff of some paper. Even if his earnings with his pen should prove small, what did that matter? He could never think of marrying now, and a very little would suffice to supply all his wants, his habits of life being simple and regular. It stung him when he remembered that there was a stain upon his name which could never be removed, but that he knew he must bear, and so he resolved to bear it bravely, as it becomes a man to bear all his burdens. With thoughts like these, the stalwart young fellow sank to sleep on the bed assigned him in the jail. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of A Man of Honor by George Carey Eggleston. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25, in which Miss Sudie acts very unreasonably. The men who make up mails and handle great bags full of letters every day of their lives grow accustomed to the business, I suppose, and learn after a while to regard the bags and their contents merely as so many pounds of mail matter. Otherwise they would soon become unfit for their duties. If they could weigh those bags with other than material scales, if they could know how many human hopes and fears, how much of human purpose and human despair, how many joys and how much of wretchedness those bags contain, if they could hear the moans that utter themselves inside the canvas, if they could know the varying purposes with which all those letters have been written, and the various effects they are destined to produce, if our mail carriers could know and feel all these things, or the half of them, we should shortly have no mail carriers at all. But fortunately there are prosaic souls enough in the world to make all necessary mail agents and postmasters, and undertakers and gravediggers out of. In the small mail bag thrown off at the courthouse one December morning, there was one little package of New York letters, 3 letters in all, but on those 3 letters hung the happiness of several human lives. Of one of them we shall learn nothing for the present. The other 2, from Robert Pagebrook to his uncle and Miss Barksdale, we have already been permitted to read. When these were received at Shirley, Miss Sudie took hers to her own room and read it there, after which she sat down and answered it. Colonel Barksdale read his with no surprise, as he had not been able to imagine any possible explanation of Robert's conduct. And now that that gentleman frankly confessed that there was none, he accepted the confession as a bit of evidence in the case, for which he had waited merely as a matter of form. It was his duty now to talk again with his niece, but he was very tender always in his dealings with her, and felt an especial tenderness now that she must be suffering sorely. He quietly inquired where she was, and learning that she was in her own room, he refrained from summoning her himself, and gave her maid particular instructions to allow no one else to intrude upon her privacy upon any pretence whatsoever. "Lucy," he said to the colored woman, "your Miss Sudie wishes to be alone for a while. Sit down in the passage near her door, but don't knock, and don't allow anyone else to knock. When she wishes to see anyone, she will open the door herself, and until then I do not want her disturbed." Then going into the dining room, where Dick was polishing the mahogany with a large piece of cork, he said, Dick, go out to the office and ask your Mas' Billy if he will be good enough to come to me in the library. I want to talk with him." When Billy came in, his father showed him Robert's letter. "The thing looks very ugly," said the younger gentleman. "Very ugly indeed," said his father. "But the confounded rascal holds up his head under it all, and acts as honorably in Sudie's case as if he had never acted otherwise than as a gentleman should. He is a puzzle to me. But of course this must end the matter. We can have nothing whatever to do with him hereafter." "But how is it, father, that they have managed to imprison him?" "I presume they have secured an order of arrest under that New York statute, which seems to have been devised as a means of securing to creditors all the advantages of imprisonment for debt without shocking the better sense of the community, which is clearly against such imprisonment. The majority of people rarely ever pay any attention to the fact so long as they are spared the name of odious things. No debtor's prison would be allowed to stand in the United States, of course, but the common jails answer all purposes when a way for getting debtors locked up in them has been devised." "But how does it happen, father," asked Mr. Billy, "that only New York has such a statute?" "Well, in New York the commercial interest overrides every other, and commercial men naturally attach undue importance to the collection of debts, and look with favor upon everything which tends to facilitate it. These things always reflect the feeling rather than the opinion of a community. In new countries, where horses are of more importance than anything else, horse stealing is pretty sure to be punished with death, either by law or by the mob, which is only public sentiment embodied. Here in Virginia you know how impossible it is to get anything like an effective statute for the suppression of dueling, simply because the ultimate public sentiment practically approves of personal warfare. But I confess I did not know that the New York statute could be stretched to cover a case like Robert's. As I understand it, there must be some evidence of fraud in the inception of the transaction." "They proceed upon affidavits, I believe," said Billy, "and when that is done it isn't hard to make out a case if the attorney is unscrupulous enough." "That's true. But isn't it curious that Edwin should have proceeded so promptly to harsh measures? He is so mild of temper that this surprises me." "Cousin Edwin doesn't always act out his own character, you know, father. His wife is the stronger willed of the two." "True. I hadn't thought of that. However, it serves the young rascal right." At this point of the conversation, Cousin Sudie's knock was heard at the inner door, and Colonel Barksdale opening the outer one said, "You'd better go out this door, William. It would embarrass Sue to find you here just now." "Come in, my daughter," he said, admitting Miss Sudie. "Sit down. I am greatly pained, on this account as well as yours, to find that Robert has no explanation to offer. But, of course, this ends it all, and you must take a little trip somewhere, my dear, until you forget all about it. Where shall we go?" "I do not care to go anywhere, Uncle Carter," replied the little maiden, without the faintest echo of a sob in her voice. "I am sorry for poor Robert, but not because I think him guilty of any dishonorable action, for indeed I do not." "But, my dear, it will never do—" "Pray hear me out, Uncle Carter, and then I will listen to anything you have to say. I love you as a father, as you know perfectly well. Indeed, I have never known you as anything else. I have always obeyed you unquestioningly, and I shall not begin to disobey you now. I shall do precisely what you tell me to do, so long as I remain in your house." "What do you mean by that, daughter?" asked her uncle, startled by the singular emphasis which Miss Sudie gave to the last clause of the sentence. "Merely this, Uncle Carter. I cannot consent to do that which my conscience teaches me is a crime, even at your command. But while I remain at Shirley as a daughter of the house, I must obey as a daughter. If you command me to do anything which I cannot do without sinning against my conscience, then I must not obey you, and when I can't obey you I must cease to be your daughter. I shall conceal nothing from you, Uncle Carter. You know that, and I beg of you don't command me to do the things which I must not do. I love you, and it would kill me. No, it would not do that, but it would pain me more than I can possibly say to leave Shirley." Colonel Barksdale leaned his head sorrowfully upon his hand. He loved this girl and held her as his own. Moreover, he had solemnly promised his dying brother to care for her always as a father cares for his children, and an oath could not have been more sacred in his eyes than this promise was. Without raising his head, he asked, "You mean, Sudie, that you will not accept Robert's release?" "Yes, uncle, that is what I mean." This was sorrowfully and gently said, but firmly, too. "He has offered to release you, has he not?" "Yes." "And in so offering, did he express or hint a wish that you should not accept his release?" "No. On the contrary, he assumed that I would accept it, and that I must do so in justice to myself. Here is his letter. Read it, if you please." Colonel Barksdale read the letter, with which the reader is already familiar, and handing it back, said, "A very proper and manly letter." "Because it came from a very proper and manly man," said Miss Sudie. "You don't believe he has been guilty of the dishonorable acts laid to his charge, then?" "Of the acts, yes. Of the dishonor, no," said the girl. "On what ground do you base your persistent good opinion of him?" "On my persistent faith in him." "Your faith is very unreasonable, my dear." "Perhaps so, but it exists, nevertheless." "Have you answered his letter?" "Yes, sir, and I have brought my answer for you to read, if you care to do so," she said, taking her letter out of her desk, which lay in her lap, and giving it to her uncle, who read as follows: "My dear Robert, I am not in the least surprised by your letter. I knew you would offer to release me from my engagement, because I knew you were a man of honor. I have never for a moment doubted that, and I do not doubt it now. Your character weighs more with me than any mere facts can. I know you are an honorable man, and knowing that, I shall not let other people's doubts upon the subject govern my action. When I listened to your words of love, and gave them a place in my heart, you were, as you say, a gentleman without reproach, and the reproach which lies upon you now does not make you less a gentleman. It is an unjust reproach, and your manliness in bearing it, and offering to accept its consequences, only serves to mark you still more distinctly as a gentleman. Shall I be less honorable, less fearlessly true than you? When I gave you my heart and promised you my hand, you had friends in abundance. Now that you have none, I have no idea of withdrawing either the gift or the promise. You say you can never clear your name of the stain which is upon it now. For that I am heartily sorry, for your sake, but as I know that the stain does not rightly belong there, it becomes my duty and my pleasure to bear it with you. I shall retain my faith in you and my love for you, and I shall profess them too on all proper occasions, and when you claim me as your wife, I shall hold up Mrs. Robert Pagebrook's head as proudly as I now hold Susan Barksdale's. Under other circumstances, I should have thought it unmaidenly to write in this way, but there must be no doubt of my meaning now. If you ever ask a release from your promise, with or without reason, I trust you know me well enough to know that it will be granted, but from my promise I shall ask none. Another reason for the frankness of this letter is that I want you, in your trouble, to know how implicitly I trust your honor, and I should certainly never trust such a letter in any but the cleanest of hands. Uncle Carter will see this before it goes, and he will know, as it is right that he should, that I have not availed myself of your proffered release. The omitted sentences with which the letter closed are not for our eyes. Even Colonel Barksdale refused to read them, feeling that they were sacred, and that the permission given him to read the letter extended no further than the end of the sentence last set down in the extract above given. Returning the sheet, he said, "I suppose you have written this after giving the matter full consideration, daughter?" "I never act without knowing what I am doing, Uncle Carter." "Well, my child, I think you are wrong, but I shall not ask you to do anything which your conscience condemns. I shall not ask you to withhold your letter, or to alter it, but I would prefer that you hold it until to-morrow, so that you may be quite sure you want to send it as it is. Will you mind doing that?" "No, Uncle Carter. I will keep it till to-morrow, if you wish, but I shall not change my mind concerning it. You are very good to me. Thank you." And kissing his forehead, she left him, not to return to her room as a more sentimental woman would have done, but to go about her daily duties, with a sober face, it is true, but with all her accustomed regularity and attention to business. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of A Man of Honor by George Carey Eggleston. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26, in which Miss Sudie adopts the Socratic method. When Miss Sudie left him, Colonel Barksdale again sent for his son and told him of that young woman's unreasonable determination. "I expected that, father, and am not at all surprised," said the young man. "Why, my son? Had you talked the matter over with her?" "No, but I know Sudie too well to expect her to give up her faith in Bob while he is under a cloud and in trouble, too. She has a mighty good head on her shoulders. But what's a woman's head worth when her heart pulls the other way? She overrides her own reason as coolly as if it were worth just nothing at all, and puts everybody else's out of the way with the utmost indifference. I know her of old. She used to take my part that way whenever I got into a boyish scrape, and before she had done with it, she always convinced me, along with everybody else, that I had done nothing to be ashamed of. The fact is, father, I like that in Sudie. She's the truest little woman I ever saw, and she sticks to her friends like mutton gravy to the roof of your mouth," said Billy, unable even at such a time as this to restrain his passion for strange metaphors. "The trait is a noble one, certainly," said the old gentleman. "But for that very reason, if for no other, We must do what we can to keep her from sacrificing herself to a noble faith in an unworthy man. Don't you think so?" "Without doubt. But what can we do? You say you do not feel free to control her." "We can at least do our duty. I have talked with her, and now I want you to do the same. She will not shun the conversation, I think, for she is a brave girl." "I will see what I can do, father," said the young man. "Possibly I may persuade her to let the matter rest where it is, for the present at least, and even that will be something gained." Colonel Barksdale was right in thinking that Miss Sudie would not seek to avoid a conversation with Billy. On the contrary, she wished especially to say something to this young gentleman, and for that very purpose she sought him in the office. He and she had been brought up as brother and sister, and there was no feeling of restraint between them now that they were grown man and woman. "Cousin Billy," she said, sitting down near him, "I want to talk with you about Robert. I want to remind you, if you will let me, of your duty to him." "What do you conceive my duty to be in the case, Sudie?" asked Billy. "To defend him," said Miss Sudie. "But how can I do that, Sudie, in face of the facts?" "You believe, then, that Robert Pagebrook, whom you know thoroughly, has done the dishonorable thing laid to his charge?" "Well," said Billy, feeling himself hardly prepared for this kind of attack, "I confess I should never have thought him capable of doing such things." "Why would you never have thought him capable of doing them, Cousin Billy?" "Oh, well, because he always seemed to be such an honorable fellow," said Billy. "You did believe him honorable, then?" asked this young female Socrates. "Certainly. You know that, Sudie." "On what did you base that belief, Cousin Billy?" "Why, on his way of doing things, on my knowledge of him, of course," replied Billy. "Well, then, is that knowledge of him of no value now?" asked Sudie. "How do you mean?" "I mean, does your knowledge of Robert weigh nothing now? Are you ready to believe on imperfect evidence that Robert Pagebrook, who you know was an honorable man, is not now an honorable man? Doesn't his character weigh anything with you? Do you believe his character has changed, or do you think it possible that he simulated that character and did it so perfectly as to deceive us all? Doesn't it seem more probable that there is some mistake about this business? In short, how can you believe Robert guilty of a thing which you know very well he wouldn't do for his head? If you wouldn't have believed it, why do you believe it?" Mr. Billy was stunned. He had been prepared for tears. He had expected to find in Sudie an unreasoning faith. He had looked for an obstinate determination on her part to adhere to her purpose. But for this kind of illogical logic he had made no preparation whatever. It had never entered his head that Miss Sudie would seriously undertake to argue the matter. The evidence against Robert he had accepted as unquestionable, and he had not expected Miss Sudie to question it in this way. "But, Cousin Sudie, you overlook the fact that Robert has confessed the very thing which you say is unlikely." "No, he has not confessed anything of the sort. Indeed, he seems to have carefully avoided doing so. In his letter to Uncle Carter he merely says, 'I can offer neither denial nor explanation of the facts alleged against me.' To me he only says, 'A stain is upon my name.' He nowhere says I am guilty." "But, Sudie," said Billy, "if he ain't guilty, Why can't he offer either denial or explanation?" "That I do not know. But I don't find it half as hard to believe that there may be good reasons for that, as to believe that an honorable man, a man whom we both know to be an honorable one, has done a dishonorable thing." "But, Sudie, why didn't Bob borrow the money of father or of me, if he honestly couldn't pay? He knew we would gladly lend it to him." "I'm glad you mentioned that. If Robert had wanted to swindle anybody, how much easier it would have been for him to write to you or Uncle Carter saying he couldn't pay and asking you to take up his protested draft for him. He knew you would have done it, and he could have then accomplished his purpose without any exposure. Almost any excuse would have satisfied you or Uncle Carter, and so the thing would have gone on for years. Wouldn't he have done exactly that, Cousin Billy, if he had wanted to swindle anybody? Men don't often covet a bad name for its own sake." "Clearly, Sudie, I am getting the worst of this argument. You are a better sophist than I ever gave you credit for being. But it's hard to believe that black is white. I'll tell you what I'll do, though, Sudie. I'll do my very best to believe that there is some sort of faint possibility that facts ain't facts, and hold myself, as nearly as I can, in readiness to believe that something may turn up in Bob's favor. If anything were to turn up, I'd be as glad of it as anybody." "But I'm not satisfied with that, Cousin Billy." "What more do you ask, Sudie?" "That you shall hold yourself in readiness to help turn something up whenever an opportunity offers. Keep a sharp lookout for things which may possibly have a bearing upon this matter, and follow up any clue you may get. Won't you do that for my sake, Cousin Billy?" "I'd do anything for your sake, Sudie, and I'd give $100 for your faith." And so ended the conversation. Mr. Billy, it must be confessed, had done little toward the accomplishment of the task he had set himself. But, as he himself put it, what on earth was a fellow to do with a faith which made incontestable truths out of impossibilities, and scattered facts before it like a flock of partridges? Mr. Billy fully appreciated the unreasonableness of Miss Sudie's logic, and yet, in spite of all, he could not help entertaining a sort of half hope that something would occur to vindicate Robert, a hope born of nothing more substantial than Miss Sudie's enthusiastic belief in her lover. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of A Man of Honor by George Carey Eggleston. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. Mr. Pagebrook accepts an invitation to lunch and another invitation. On the morning after Robert's incarceration, his attorney came at the appointed hour for the purpose of preparing the papers on which application was to be made for his discharge. "I have the affidavits already, I believe, Mr. Pagebrook, and we have only to make a complete list of your property." "That will be easily done, sir," said Robert, with a feeling of grim amusement, "as I have literally nothing except my trunk and its contents." "You have your claim on that bank for money deposited. I suppose that must be included, though it is only a chose in action." "Oh, put it in by all means," said Robert. "I do not wish to misrepresent anything or to withhold anything. I only wish the chose in action, as you call it, were of sufficient value to discharge the debt. I should then quit here free from all indebtedness, except to you for your fee, and should not have this thing to pay." Your discharge, I think, will free you in law from... But it will not free me in honor, sir. It will give me time, however, and the very first use I shall make of that time will be to earn the money with which to pay off this, my only, debt. I should never ask a discharge at all, if the asking supposed any purpose on my part to avoid the payment of the debt. Pardon me. This talk must sound odd to you, coming from a man in my present position. I forgot that I am an absconding debtor. You will think my talk a cheap kind of honesty, costing nothing. No, Pagebrook, if you will allow me to drop the mister, I should trust you in any transaction, though I have not known you a week. I don't believe you are an absconding debtor, and I'm not going to believe it on the strength of any oaths Messrs. Steele, Flint, and Sharp may make." As he said this, the young lawyer took Robert's hand, and Robert found himself wholly unable to utter a word by way of reply. He did not want to shed tears in the presence of his jail attendants, but the lawyer saw them standing in his eyes, and prevented any effort at replying by turning at once to the matter in hand. "Come, Pagebrook," he said, "this isn't business. Let me see, what bank was it that you deposited with?" "The Essex," said Robert. "The Essex," said the lawyer. "What was that I saw in the Tribune this morning about that bank? I think it was the Essex. Let me see," running his eye over the columns of the newspaper, which he had taken from his pocket. "Ah, here it is. By George! My dear Pagebrook, I congratulate you. Your bank has resumed. See, here is the item. Philadelphia, December 3rd. The Essex Bank of this city, which suspended payment some weeks since, will resume business tomorrow. Its affairs were found to be in a very favorable condition, and at a meeting of the stockholders held today, the deficit in its assets was covered, and its capital made good by subscription. It is not thought that any run will be made upon it, but ample preparations have been made to meet such a contingency. Again, I congratulate you right heartily. This means, then, that my $1,600, that was the total amount of my deposit, is intact, and that I may check against it as soon as I choose, does it? Certainly. Then let us suspend our preparations for securing my release. I will pay out of this instead of begging out. I will draw at once for enough to cover this debt and your fees, and ask you to put the draft into bank for collection. We will have returns by the day after tomorrow, doubtless, and I shall then go out of here with my head up." "We'll end this business sooner than that, Pagebrook," said the lawyer. "Draw your draft. I'll endorse it, take it to the bank where I deposit, get it cashed at once, and have you out of here in time for a 2:00 lunch. You'll lunch with me, of course." "Pardon me, but you have no means of knowing that I have any money in that bank," said Robert. "Yes, indeed I have." "What is it?" "Your word. I told you I would trust you." Robert looked at the man a moment, and then, taking his hand, said, "I accept your confidence frankly. Thank you. Draw the draft, please, and I will sign it." The draft was soon drawn, and at 2:00 that day, just 24 hours after his arrest, Robert sat down to lunch with his friend in a downtown eating house. While the two gentlemen were engaged with their lunch, Robert's friend Dudley, who had been eating a chop at the farther end of the room, espied his acquaintance, and approaching him said, "How are you, Pagebrook? Are you specially engaged for this afternoon?" "No, I believe not," said Robert. I have nothing to do except to finish an article which I want to offer you tomorrow, and I can do that tonight." "Suppose you come up to the office then after you finish your lunch. I want to talk with you." "I will be there within half an hour, if that will suit you," said Robert. "Very well. I'll expect you." Accordingly, Robert bade his friend adieu after lunch, and went immediately to the editor's room. Mr. Dudley closed the door, first saying to his messenger who sat in the anteroom, "I shall be busy for some time, Eddie, and can't see anybody. If anyone calls, tell him I am closeted with a gentleman on important business and can see nobody. Now, Pagebrook," he resumed, taking his seat, "you ought to quit teaching." "Why?" asked Robert. "Well, you're a born writer, certainly, and if I am not greatly mistaken, a born journalist, too. You have a knack of knowing just what points people want to hear about. I've been struck with that in every article you have written for me, and especially in this last one. Do you know I've rejected no less than a dozen well-written articles on that very subject, just because they treated every phase of it except the right one, and didn't come within a mile of that? Now you've hit it exactly, as you always do. You've got hold of precisely the things that nobody knows anything about, and everybody wants to know all about, and that's journalism." "Thank you," said Robert. "You really think then that I might make myself a successful journalist if I were to try?" "I know you would. You have precisely the right sort of ideas. You discriminate between the things that are wanted and the things that are not. I have long since discovered that this thing that men call writing ability and journalistic ability isn't like anything else. It crops out where you would never look for it, and where you think it ought to be, it isn't. You can't coax or nurse it into existence to save your life. If a man has it, he has it, and if he hasn't it, he hasn't it, and nobody can give it to him. It isn't contagious, and I honestly believe it isn't acquirable. And that's why I'm certain of you. You've shown that you have it, and one showing is as good as 100. "I am greatly pleased," said Robert, "to know that you think so well of me in this respect, for I have resigned my professorship, and determined to make my way, to the best of my ability, as a journalist hereafter." "You have?" "Yes. I sent my letter of resignation yesterday." "I'm heartily glad of it, old fellow, and selfishly glad, too, for it was to persuade you to do that I sat down to talk to you. You see, my health is not very good lately. The fact is, I have been using the spur too much, and am pretty well run down with overwork. The publishers have been urging me to get an assistant, and the trouble is to get one who can really relieve me of a share of the work. I can get plenty of people to undertake it, but I have to go over their work to be sure of it, and it's easier to do it myself from the first. Now you are just the man I want, if you can stand the salary. The publishers will let me pay $40 a week. You can make more than that from the outside, I suppose, but it's better to be in a regular situation, I think. How would you like to try the thing?" "Nothing could be more to my taste. I think I should like this better than daily paper work, and besides, it gives one a better opportunity for growth. But before we talk any more about it, I feel myself in honor bound to tell you what has happened to me lately. If you care then to repeat your offer, I shall gladly accept it, but if you feel the slightest hesitation about it, I shall not blame you for not renewing it." And Robert told him everything, but Dudley declined to believe that there had been any just cause for the arrest, or that Robert had in any way violated the strictest canons of honor. This young man seemed, indeed, to be perfect master of the art of making people believe in him in spite of the most damaging facts. Miss Sudie's faith in him never wavered for an instant. Even Billy had to keep a synopsis of the evidence against his cousin constantly in mind to keep himself from believing that he couldn't see through glass, as he phrased it. The New York lawyer, summoned to get the young man out of jail, backed his faith in him, as we have seen, by endorsing his draft for several $100s. And now Dudley, after hearing a plain statement of the facts from Robert's own lips, dismissed them as of no consequence, and set up his own unreasonable faith as a complete answer to them. He renewed his offer, and Robert accepted it, becoming office editor of the weekly paper for which he had recently been writing. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of A Man of Honor by George Carey Eggleston. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. Major Pagebrook asserts himself. It now becomes necessary to a proper understanding of this history that we shall go back a day or two, to the day, in fact, on which Robert's letters were received at Shirley. I said there were 3 New York letters in the mail bag thrown off at the courthouse that morning. The 3rd letter there referred to was from the law firm of Steele, Flint & Sharp. It was addressed to Edwin Pagebrook, Esquire, and quite by accident it fell into that gentleman's hands. I say by accident, because Cousin Sarah Ann had taken unusual precautions to prevent precisely this result. After writing to the lawyers, it occurred to that estimable lady that a reply would come in due time, and that as she had taken the liberty of signing her husband's name to her letter, the reply would be addressed to him rather than to her, and she greatly feared that he would have an opportunity to read it. She particularly wished that this should not happen. She knew her mild-mannered and long-suffering husband thoroughly, and while she felt free to torment him in various ways, she had learned, from 1 or 2 bits of experience, that it was not the part of wisdom to tax his endurance too far. Accordingly, she took pains to prevent him from visiting the courthouse while she was expecting the letter. She laid various plans for the purpose of keeping him occupied on the plantation every day, and took care to secure the first look into the family post-bag whenever the servant returned with it. On the morning in question, however, as Major Pagebrook was riding over his plantation inspecting work, he met a neighbor who was going to the courthouse, and having some small matters to attend to there, he determined to join the neighbor in his ride. Upon his arrival he called for his letters, and so it came about that the note in which Messrs. Steele, Flint & Sharp begged to inform him of Robert's arrest, in accordance with his instructions, fell into his hands. At first he was puzzled and thought there must have been some mistake, but after a while a glimmering of the truth dawned upon him, and in his smothered way he was exceedingly angry. He had condemned Robert's misconduct as severely as anybody, but had never dreamed of proceeding to harsh measures in the matter. Besides, it was only the day before that Robert's remittance of $100 had come to him, and in acknowledging its receipt he had partially satisfied his resentment by telling his cousin what he thought of him, and to learn now that the young man was in jail for the fault and apparently at his behest was sorely displeasing to him. And worse than all, his wife had taken an unwarrantable liberty in the affair, and this he determined to resent. He mounted his horse, therefore, and was on the point of starting homeward, when Dr. Harrison accosted him. "Good morning, Major Pagebrook. May I speak to you a moment?" "Good morning, Charles." "Has there been any administrator appointed for Ewing's estate?" "No, not yet. I reckon I must take out papers next court day, as he was of age when he died. It's only a matter of form, I reckon, as there are no debts." "Well, my only reason for asking is I hold Ewing's note for $225. I'm in no hurry, only I wanted to act regularly and get it in shape by presenting it." "You have Ewing's note? Why, what is it for?" asked Major Pagebrook in astonishment. "Borrowed money," answered the doctor. "Borrowed money? But how did he come to borrow it?" "Well, the fact is Ewing got to playing bluff with Foggy one day just before he got sick, and Foggy fleeced him pretty badly, and I lent him the money to pay out with. He didn't want to owe it to Foggy, you know." "Have you the note with you?" asked Major Pagebrook. "No, it's in my office, but I can get it if you'd like to look at it." "No, it's no matter, if you can tell me the date." "It bears date November 19th, I think." "Just one day after he came of age," said Major Pagebrook. "Well, I'll see about it, Charles." And with this the two gentlemen separated. Major Pagebrook rode homeward, meditating upon the occurrences of the morning. He had determined to manage his own business hereafter without tolerating improper interference upon the part of his wife, and he was in position to do this, too, except with regard to the home plantation, which, as Ewing had informed Robert, was held in Cousin Sarah Ann's name. Major Pagebrook was a quiet man and a long-suffering one. He liked nothing so much as peace, and to keep the peace he had always yielded to the more aggressive nature of his wife. But he felt now that the time had come for him to assert his supremacy in business matters, and he determined to assert it very quietly but very positively. One point was as good as another, he thought, for the purpose, and this newly discovered debt of Ewing's gave him an excellent occasion for the self-assertion upon which he had resolved. Several times of late he had mildly suggested to Cousin Sarah Ann the propriety of putting Ewing's papers into Billy Barksdale's hands for examination, so that the boy's affairs might be properly and legally adjusted. To every such suggestion Cousin Sarah Ann, who carried the key of Ewing's portable desk, had turned a deaf ear, saying that there were no debts one way or the other, and that she wouldn't have anybody overhauling the poor boy's private papers. Now, however, Major Pagebrook had made up his mind to put the desk into Billy's hands without asking the excellent lady's consent. "Don't take my horse, Jim," he said to his servant upon arriving at home. "I am going to ride again presently. Just tie him to the rack till I want him." Going into the house he met Cousin Sarah Ann, to whom he said, "Sarah Ann, I will write my own letters and attend to my own business hereafter, and I'll thank you not to sign my name for me again. You have placed me in a very awkward position, and I can't explain it to anybody without exposing you. Understand me now, please. I will not tolerate any such interference in future." Ordinarily, Cousin Sarah Ann would have been ready enough with a reply to such a remark as this, but just now she was fairly frightened by her husband's tone and manner. She saw at a glance that he was in a very serious earnest, and she knew him well enough to know that it would not do to provoke him further. She was always afraid of him, even when she was riding roughshod over him. When he seemed most submissive and she most aggressive, she was in the habit of scanning his countenance very carefully, as an engineer watches his steam gauge. When she saw steam rising she usually had the safety valve, a flood of tears, ready for immediate use. Just now she saw indications of an explosion which appalled her, and she dared not face the danger for a moment. Without reply, therefore, she sank, weeping, into the nearest chair, while her husband walked into her room, opened her wardrobe, and took from it the little desk in which his son's letters and papers were locked. Coming back to her, he said, "I will take the key to this desk, if you please." She looked up with a frightened countenance, and asked, "What for?" "I want to open the desk." "What are you going to do with it?" "I'm going to put it into my lawyer's hands." "Wait, then. I must look over the papers first." "No, Billy will do that." "But there's some of mine in it, private ones." "It doesn't matter. Billy will sort them and return yours to you." "But he shan't look at my papers." "Give me the key, Sarah Ann." "I can't. It's lost." "Very well, then," said he, taking his knife from his pocket, breaking the frail lock, and walking out of the house without another word. Cousin Sarah Ann was thoroughly overcome. She knew that her husband had received the reply to her letter, which she had meant to receive herself, and she knew too that her mastery over him was at an end, for the present at least. Worse than all, she knew that the desk and its contents would inevitably go into Billy Barksdale's hands, and she had her own reasons for thinking this the sorest affliction possible to her. There was no help for it now, however, and she could do nothing except throw herself on her bed and shed tears of bitter mortification, vexation, and dread. Meanwhile, Major Pagebrook galloped over to Shirley, with the desk under his arm. The conversation already reported between Billy and Miss Sudie was hardly more than finished when he dismounted and walked into the young lawyer's office. He opened his business by telling Billy about the note held by Dr. Harrison. "I don't understand it," he said. "Harrison says the note is dated November 19th, which was just one day after Ewing came of age, and I remember that Ewing was taken sick on the morning of his birthday, very sick, as you know, and never left his bed afterwards." "When was Ewing at the court house last?" asked Billy. "Not since the day Robert left." "Did he owe Harrison any money that you know of?" "No, but Harrison says Foggy won that much from him and he had to borrow to pay it." "You are sure, however, that Ewing could not possibly have had a chance to sign the note after he came of age?" "Of course he couldn't. He was delirious from the very first, and we never left him." "I think I see how it is," said Billy. "Foggy and Charley Harrison are too intimate for any straight dealings. I reckon Charley was as deeply interested in the winnings as Foggy was, but they have made Ewing execute the note to Charley for money borrowed to pay Foggy with, so that it would be legally good. They made him date it ahead, too, so that it would appear to have been executed after Ewing came of age. They didn't anticipate his sickness, and they haven't thought to compare dates. I think we can beat them this time, when they get ready to sue." "But we mustn't let them sue, Billy. said Major Pagebrook. "I would never consent to plead the Baby Act, or to get out of it by any legal quibble, if the signature is genuine, as I reckon it is. That wouldn't be honorable. No, I shall pay the note off, and I only want to know whether I must charge it to Ewing's estate or not, after taking out administration papers. If I can, I ought to, in justice to the other children. If I can't, I must pay it myself. Look into it, please, and let me know about it. I have brought you Ewing's desk, so you can look over all his papers and attend to all his affairs for me. I want to get everything straight." So saying, he took his leave. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of A Man of Honor by George Carey Eggleston. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29. Mr. Barksdale the Younger Goes Upon a Journey. Not until the next morning did Mr. Billy find time to examine the papers in Ewing's desk. Indeed, even then he deemed the matter one of very little consequence, inasmuch as the papers, whatever they might happen to be, were probably of no legal importance, being of necessity the work of a minor. There might be memoranda there, however, and possibly a will disposing of personal property, which, under the law of Virginia, would be good if executed by a minor over 18 years of age. In view of these possibilities, therefore, Billy sat down to the task of examining the papers, which were pretty numerous, such as they were. After a while he became interested in the very miscellaneousness of the assortment. Little memoranda were there, of the date on which a horse had been shod, of the amount paid for a new pair of boots, of the times at which the boy had written letters to his friends, and of 100 other unimportant things. There were bits of poor verse, too, such as may be found in the desk of almost every boy. Old letters, full of nothing, were there in abundance, but nothing which could possibly be of any value to anybody. On all the letters, except one, was marked, in Ewing's handwriting, "To be burned without reading in case of my death." The one exception attracted Billy's attention, and opening it, he was surprised to find Robert Pagebrook's name appended to it. It was, in fact, the letter which Cousin Sarah Ann had opened during her son's last illness. After reading it, Mr. Billy sat down to think. Presently, looking at his watch, he went to the door and called a servant. "Go and ask your Miss Sudie to put 2 or 3 shirts and some socks and handkerchiefs into my satchel for me, and then you go and tell Polidor to saddle Graybeard and the bay, and get ready to go with me to the court house directly. Do you hear?" The servant made no answer to the question with which Mr. Billy closed his speech. Indeed, that gentleman expected none. Virginians always ask, "Do you hear?" when they give instructions to servants, and they never get or expect an answer. Without the question, however, they would never secure attention to the instruction. To say, "Do so and so," without adding, "Do you hear?" would be the idlest possible waste of words on the part of any one giving an order to the average Virginian house servant. Mr. Billy was in the habit of making sudden journeys on business, without giving the slightest warning to the family, except that contained in a request that his satchel or saddle-bags be packed, so that Miss Sudie was not in the least surprised when his present message came to her. She was surprised, however, when, instead of riding away without a word of farewell, as he usually did, he came into the house, and, kissing her tenderly, said, "Keep your spirits up, Sudie. and don't let things worry you too much. I'm going to Richmond on the 2:00 train, and don't know how long I'll be gone. Good-bye, little girl." And he kissed her again. All this was quite out of character, Miss Sudie felt. Billy was affectionate enough at all times, but he detested leave-takings, and always avoided them when he could. To seek one was quite unlike him, and Miss Sudie was puzzled to know what prompted him to do it on this particular occasion. He rode away, however, without offering any explanation whatever. Mr. Billy went to Richmond, as he had said he intended doing, but he did not remain there an hour. He went to the cashier of a bank, a gentleman with whom he was well acquainted, got from him a letter of introduction to a prominent man in Philadelphia, and left for that city on the first train. Arriving in Philadelphia about 9:00 the next day, Mr. Billy ate a hasty breakfast, and proceeded to the little collegiate institute in which Robert had once been a professor, as the reader will remember. Introducing himself to President Currier, he asked for a private interview, and was invited for the purpose into Dr. Currier's inner office. "I believe, Doctor," he said, after telling that gentleman who he was, "that there was something due Professor Pagebrook on his salary at the time his connection with this college terminated. Was there not?" "Yes, sir. There was about $300 due him, if I remember correctly, but it has been paid, I think." "Have you any way of ascertaining precisely how and when?" asked Billy. "Yes. My own letter book should show. Let me see," turning over the leaves. "Ah, here it is. A draft for the amount was sent to him by letter on the 8th of November, addressed to some courthouse, Virginia." "Thank you," said Billy. "The draft, I suppose, was regular New York exchange?" "Of course." "Would you mind telling me from what bank you bought it, and to whose order, in the first place, it was made payable? Pardon my asking such questions, but I need this information for use in the cause of justice." "Oh, you need offer no apology, I assure you, sir," returned the president. "I have nothing to conceal in the matter. The draft was drawn by the Susquehanna Bank, and to my order, I think. Yes, I remember endorsing it." "Thank you, sir," said Billy. "You are very courteous, and I am indebted to you for information which I should have found it difficult to get from any other source. Good morning, sir." Leaving the college, which was situated in one of the suburbs, Mr. Billy took a carriage and drove into the city. There he delivered his letter of introduction, and secured from the gentleman to whom it was addressed a personal introduction to the cashier of the Susquehanna Bank. To this latter person he said: "I am looking up evidence in a case, and, if I am not greatly mistaken, you can help me in an effort to set a wrong right. On the 8th of last month you sold a draft on New York for $300, payable to the order of David Currier. Now, in the ordinary course of business, I suppose that draft has been returned to you after payment." "Yes, if it was paid before the first of the month. We settle with our New York correspondents once a month. I'll look at the last batch of returned checks and see." "Thank you. I should be glad to see the endorsements on the paper, if possible." The cashier went to the vault, and returning with a large bundle of canceled checks, soon found the one wanted. Billy turned it over and examined the endorsements on the back. Then, turning to the banker, he asked: "Would it be possible for me to get temporary possession of this draft by depositing the amount of its face with you until its return?" "You merely wish it for use in evidence?" asked the banker. That's all," said Billy. "You can take it then, without a deposit, Mr. Barksdale. It is of no value now, but we usually keep our cancelled exchange, so I shall be obliged if you will return this when you've done with it." This was precisely what Robert had come to Philadelphia to secure, and after finding what the endorsements on the draft were, he would willingly have paid its face outright, if that had been necessary, to get possession of it. Who knows what the value of a bit of writing may be, even after its purpose has to all appearance been fully answered? I know a great commercial house in which it is an inexorable law that no bit of paper once written on in the way of business shall ever be destroyed, however valueless it may seem to be, and on more than one occasion the wisdom of the rule has been strikingly made manifest. So it was with this paid, cancelled, and returned draft. Worthless in all eyes but his, to Billy it was far more precious than if it had been crisp and new, and payable to his own order. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of A Man of Honor by George Carey Eggleston. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30. The younger Mr. Barksdale asks to be put upon his oath. It was nearly noon when the train which brought Billy Barksdale back from Philadelphia stopped at the courthouse, and that young gentleman went from the station immediately to the courtroom, where the circuit court, as he knew, was in session. "Has the grand jury been impaneled yet?" he asked the Commonwealth's attorney. "Yes, it has just gone out, but as usual there is nothing for it to do, so it will report no bills in an hour or so, I reckon." "Have me sworn and sent before it then," said Billy. "I think I can put it in the way of finding something to do." The official was astonished, but he lost no time in complying with the rather singular request. Billy went before the grand jury, and remained there for a considerable time. This was a very unusual occurrence in every way, and it quickly produced a buzz of excitement in and about the building. There was rarely ever anything for grand juries to do in this quiet county, and when there was anything, it usually hinged upon some publicly known and talked of matter. Everybody knew in advance what it was about, and the probable result was easy to predict. Now, however, all was mystery. A prominent young lawyer had been sworn and sent before the grand jury at his own request, and the length of time during which he was detained there effectually dispelled the belief which at first obtained that he merely wanted to secure the presentment of some negligent road overseer. Even the Commonwealth's attorney could not manage to look wise enough, as he sat there stroking his beard, to deceive anybody into the belief that he knew what was going on. The minutes were very long ones. The excitement soon extended beyond the courthouse, and everybody in the village was on tiptoe with suppressed curiosity. The courtroom was full to overflowing when Billy came quietly out of the grand jury's apartment and took his seat in the bar as if nothing out of the ordinary course of affairs had happened. It did not tend to allay the excitement, certainly, when the deputy sheriff on duty at the door of the jury room beckoned to the Commonwealth's attorney, and that gentleman went upstairs 3 steps at a time, disappearing within the chamber devoted to the secret inquest and remaining there. When half an hour later Major Edwin Pagebrook was called, sworn, and sent up as a witness, wild rumors of a secret crime among the better classes began to circulate freely in the crowd, starting from nowhere and gradually taking definite shape as they spread from one to another of the eager villagers. The excitement was now absolutely painful in its intensity, and even the judge himself began walking restlessly back and forth in the space set apart for the bench. When Major Pagebrook came out of the room with a downcast face, he went immediately home, and Rosenwater, a merchant in the village, was called. When he came out, distinct efforts were made to worm the secret from him. He was mindful of his oath, however, and refused to say anything. Finally, the members of the grand jury marched slowly downstairs and took their stand in front of the clerk's desk. "Poll the grand jury," said the judge. When that ceremony was over, the question which everybody in the building had been mentally asking for hours was formulated by the court. "Gentlemen of the grand jury, have you any presentments to make?" "We have, your Honor," answered the foreman. "Read the report of the grand jury, Mr. Clerk." The official rose, and after adjusting his spectacles very deliberately, read aloud: "We, the grand jury, on our oaths present Dr. Charles Harrison and James Madison Raves for forgery and for a conspiracy to defraud Edwin Pagebrook, on or about the 10th day of November, in this present year, within the jurisdiction of this honorable court." The crowd was fairly stunned. Nobody knew or could guess what it meant. The Commonwealth's attorney was the first to speak. "As the legal representative of the Commonwealth, I move the court to issue a warrant for the arrest of Charles Harrison and James Madison Raves, and I ask that the grand jury be instructed to return to their room and to put their indictments in proper form." The two men thus accused of crime being present in court were taken in charge by the sheriff. "If the Commonwealth's attorney has no further motions to make in this case," said the judge, "the court will take a recess, in order to give time for the preparation of indictments in due form." "May it please the court," said the official addressed, "I have only to ask that your Honor will instruct the sheriff to separate the two prisoners during the recess. I do not know that this is necessary, but it may tend to further the interests of justice." "The court sees no reason to refuse the request," said the judge. "Mr. Sheriff, you will see that your two prisoners are not allowed to confer together in any way until after the reassembling of the court at 4 o'clock. Chapter 31 of A Man of Honor by George Carey Eggleston. Recording is in the public domain. Chapter 31 Mr. William Barksdale Explains. Precisely what Dr. Harrison's emotions were when he found himself in the sheriff's hands, nobody is likely ever to know, as that gentleman was always of taciturn mood in matters closely concerning himself, and on the present occasion was literally dumb. With Foggy the case was different. He was always a prudent man. He was not given to the taking of unnecessary risks for the sake of abstract principles. He made no pretensions to the possession of heroic fortitude under affliction, and he had no special reputation for high-toned honor to lose. The clutch of the law was to him an uncomfortable one, and he was prepared to escape it by any route which might happen to be open to him. This disposition upon his part was an important factor in the problem which Billy had set out to solve. He knew Foggy was a moral coward, and upon his cowardice he depended, in part, for the success of his undertaking. As soon as court adjourned, the Commonwealth's attorney requested the members of the grand jury to make themselves as comfortable as might be while he should be engaged in the preparation of formal indictments against the two prisoners. Going then to his office, he closeted himself with Billy Barksdale, who had preceded him thither by his request. "You'll help me with this prosecution, won't you, Billy?" he asked. "With as good a will as I ever carried to a fish fry," said Billy. "Well, then," said the attorney, "tell me just how the thing stands. I confess I'm all in a jumble about it. Begin at the beginning and tell the whole story. Then we'll know where we stand and how to proceed." Accordingly, Billy recounted the history of the protested draft, the promise to pay, its non-fulfillment, and the trouble which ensued. He then continued, "My suspicions as to the real facts of the case were aroused by accident. Major Pagebrook consulted me a few days ago about a note signed by Ewing Pagebrook, drawn in favor of Charley Harrison, which, Harrison said, had been given him when he advanced money to Ewing with which to pay a gambling debt to Foggy. That note was evidently dated ahead, as it bore date of November the 19th, one day after Ewing attained his majority, when, in fact, the boy was taken ill on the morning of his 21st birthday and never left his bed afterwards. This confirmed me in the belief that Foggy and Harrison were confederates in their gambling operations. They fleeced the boy, and then had him borrow the money with which to pay from Harrison, and give a note for it, so as to make the consideration good. And they took pains to have him dated ahead, so as to get rid of the minority trouble. This by itself would have amounted to nothing, but in looking over Ewing's papers, I found a letter there from Bob Pagebrook, which I happened accidentally to know was received during Ewing's illness. Here it is. I'll read it. "My dear Ewing, I cannot tell you how grieved I am at the news your letter brings me. I can ill afford to lose the $300 which I entrusted to you to hand to your father, and even if you do make it good when you come of age, as you so solemnly promise me you will, I am, meanwhile, placed in a very awkward position with regard to it. I promised your father to pay him that money by a certain day, and was greatly pleased, as you know, when, upon arriving at the court house on my way north, I found the remittance awaiting me there, as it enabled me to make the payment in advance of the time agreed upon. When I, in my haste to catch the train, gave you the check to give to your father, I dismissed the subject from my mind, and set about the work of repairing my fortunes with a light heart, little thinking that matters would turn out as they have. But while I am sorely annoyed by the fact that this may place me in an awkward position, I am willing to trust my reputation in your hands. Remember that you are now bound in honor, not merely to pay this money as soon as you shall attain your majority, but also to protect me from undeserved disgrace by frankly stating the facts of the case to your father, in the event of his entertaining doubts of my integrity. This much you are in honor bound to do in any case, and you have also given me your word that you will do it. If your father shall seem disposed to think me not unduly dilatory in the matter of payment, you need tell him nothing. You may spare yourself that mortification, send me the money, and I will remit it to him, merely saying that unavoidable circumstances, which I am not at liberty to explain, have prevented the earlier payment which I intended to make. But in agreeing to do this, Ewing, I am moved solely by my desire to shield you from disgrace and consequent ruin. When I gave you that money for your father it was a sacred trust, and in converting it to other uses you not only wronged me, but you made yourself guilty of something very like a crime. Pardon me if I speak plainly, for I am speaking only for your good, and I speak only to you. I want you to understand how terribly wrong and altogether dishonorable your act was, so that you may never be guilty of another such. I am not disposed to reproach you, but I do want to warn you. You are the son of a gentleman, and you have no right to bring disgrace upon your father's name. You ought not to gamble, and if you do gamble, you have no right to surrender your honor in payment of your losses. I promise you, as you ask me to do, that I will not tell what you have done, and you know I never break a promise under any circumstances whatever. But in promising this, I place my own reputation in your keeping, depending upon you, in the event of necessity, to frankly acknowledge your fault, so that I may not appear to have run away from a debt which in fact I have paid. "When I read that letter," continued Billy, "I began to see daylight. Bob had given his word of honor to Ewing not to expose him. Ewing had died before he could make the money matter good, and Bob, like the great, big, honorable, dear old fellow that he is, allowed himself to go to jail and bear the reputation of an absconding debtor, rather than break his promise to the dead boy. He paid the money again, too. I suspected, of course, that Foggy and Charley Harrison were mixed up in the matter some way, particularly as the very last visit Ewing ever made to the courthouse was made on the day that Bob went away. I went to Philadelphia, and there found the canceled draft, drawn in favor of David Currier, endorsed to Robert Pagebrook, and by him endorsed to Edwin Pagebrook. Then followed, as you know, an endorsement to James M. Raves, signed E. Pagebrook. That, of course, was written by Ewing, who at the suggestion of these two men made the draft over to them, or to one of them, by signing his own name, which happened, when written with the initial only, to be the same as his father's. Foggy then endorsed it to Harrison, and he, being respectable, had no difficulty in getting Rosenwater to cash it for him. It never entered Rosenwater's head, of course, to question any of the signatures back of Harrison's. Now my theory is that this draft did not cover Ewing's losses by $225, and so the two thrifty gentlemen made the boy execute the note that Harrison holds for that amount, dating it ahead, and making it for borrowed money. "You're right, Barksdale, without a doubt," said the Commonwealth's attorney. "But how are we going to make a jury see it? There's plenty of evidence to found an indictment on, but I'm afraid there ain't enough to secure a conviction." "That's true," said Billy, "but we must do our very best. If we can't convict both, we may one. And even if we fail altogether in the prosecution, we will at least expose the rascals, and this county will be too hot for them afterwards. Foggy is always shaky in the knees, and if we give him half a chance will turn state's evidence. Why not sound him on the subject?" Foggy needed very little sounding indeed. At the first intimation that there might be hope for him if he would tell what he knew, he volunteered a confession, which bore out Billy's theory to the letter. From his statement, too, it appeared that Harrison was the author of the whole scheme. He had overborne Ewing's scruples, and by dint of threats compelled him to commit a practical forgery by writing his own name in such a way as to make it appear to be his father's. While Foggy was at it, he made a clean breast, telling all about his partnership with Harrison in the gambling operations, and admitting that the note Harrison held was dated ahead and given solely for a gambling debt. The Commonwealth's attorney agreed to enter a nolle prosequi in Foggy's case, and to transfer him at the trial from the prisoner's box to the witness stand. When Billy came out from this conference, he found Major Pagebrook awaiting an opportunity to speak to him. The Major, it seems, after going home, had returned to the courthouse. "Billy," he said, "I know now about that letter from Robert to Ewing. Sarah Ann has told me she read it when it came. What is to be done about it?" "Nothing," said Billy, "except that you will of course return Robert the extra $300 he has paid you." "Of course I'll do that. But, I mean, the fact is I don't want that letter to appear on the trial. You will have to tell where you got it, and it will come out, in spite of everything, that Sarah Ann knew of it." "Well, Cousin Edwin, what am I to do? This has been a wretched business from first to last. Poor Bob has suffered severely for Ewing's fault, and, I must speak plainly, through your wife's iniquity. Not only has he had to pay the money twice, he has been sent to jail, and but for a lucky accident his reputation as an honorable man would have been destroyed forever, and that merely to gratify your wife's petty and unreasonable spite against him. It became my duty to unravel this mystery for the sake of freeing Bob from an unjust and undeserved disgrace. In doing that, I have accidentally stumbled upon the discovery of a crime, and even if it were not illegal, I am not the man to compound a felony. For you I am heartily sorry, but your wife is only reaping what she has sown. I would do anything honorable to spare your feelings, Cousin Edwin, but I cannot help giving evidence in this case. I really do not see, however, precisely how Bob's letter can be used as evidence. If it had been sufficient in itself to establish the facts to which it referred, I should have used it to set Bob right, and the thing would have ended there. But Bob's statement was of course an interested one, and I feared that after a time, if not immediately, gossip would seize upon that point and say the whole thing was made up merely to clear Bob. I knew he would never show Ewing's letter to which his was a reply, and so I set myself to work hunting up the draft. I don't see how the letter can well come up on the trial, but if it should become necessary for me to tell about it, I must tell all about it, of course." Major Pagebrook walked away, his head bowed as if there were a heavy weight upon his shoulders, and Billy pitied him heartily. This woman, who in her groundless malignity had wrought so much wrong and brought so much of sorrow upon the good old man, was his wife, and he could not free himself from the fact or its consequences. He had never willingly done a wrong in his life, and it seemed peculiarly hard that he should now have to suffer so sorely for the sins of the woman whom he called wife. End of chapter 31.